everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
Hey, it is still 2021, so it's Jackie coming in the rear, but I'm just bringing it up.
When are you guys changing that around?
2022.
2022.
It's coming up.
Okay.
Can't wait.
That is good to know.
5 years at the end.
It's been a long 5 years. Jack, I had a couple things I wanted to mention to you. Love the mug. I love your tea. Need a little more energy when you come in. But thank you for trying.
Oh my goodness.
Did you like that? That's some feedback I just had for you.
Yeah, and you know what? I really liked the love the mug and tea feedback, so that's what I'm going to bring home with me tonight.
Well, as long as you don't yell at me, because then it might make me never give feedback again. I also probably should have given you this feedback when we started the podcast as opposed to 5 years into the podcast.
I was going to say, I really like my feedback step by step at each individual point of the podcast. So if you could just tell me how I'm doing every 2 minutes.
There's got to be someone out there who loves feedback years into a podcast, though. I'm not sure what the research says. If only there was someone to help us. But wait, there are two someones, and we have them both here listening to our jokey feedback talk. It's Dr. Tyra Sellers and Dr. Seth Walker. Hello, both of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show to set us straight on feedback and when it should be given.
Hey, y'all.
Hello.
So tonight's episode is all about, or whenever you're listening to this episode, is all about receiving feedback. We've talked a lot on the show about feedback in behavior skills training, does feedback work, feedback in OBM. We're really going to get specifically into work on the receipt of feedback because it is an area that both of you, I think this might be a first, both of you have researched and published on, because we've had single authors who wrote a paper, and so they were the only person to write the paper. We've had a couple episodes, I think, where one author wrote all the papers we discussed, but I don't think we've ever had two authors on a paper and both of them on the show at the exact same time. So this is a real momentous occasion for us. We're very excited.
I feel like we need a drum roll or something.
I'm the sound effect girl,
Yeah,
so I got
Jackie's.
this.
She used to work for Disney in the Foley department. She made all the horse sounds. Oh no, Mickey, look out.
Man, that would be a good job.
So before we start talking about receiving feedback in our articles for tonight, I'm sure everyone would love to hear a little bit about both of you, where you come from. I mean, they probably have some sense, but just in case, they've like Tyra Sellers, Seth Walker, never heard of these two. Would love to kind of hear a little bit about your background and sort of how you came to this topic.
Seth, why don't you go first?
Yeah, definitely. My origin story is a little bit shorter than Tyra's, so I'll start off. It all kind of started, I graduated from a small liberal arts college in Salt Lake City, Utah, and kind of kicked around working in the outdoor industry for a little while. Never really found anything there that I liked, and wound up taking a job working with adults with disabilities. And that was when I met a behavior analyst, and he kind of made sense of the world for me. And so I started pursuing that, got a job working with children with autism, doing that frontline staff work, and really developed a passion for it. Decided to get my BC ABA at the time. There wasn't really an established program in Salt Lake City, so I did the Florida Institute of Technology online programs and just really found something that I felt that I could do forever, and worked my way into a master's program at the University of Utah, went through their second cohort of their ABA program, and could not get enough after that either, and wound up meeting somebody who knew that Tyra was looking for a student. And I called Tyra up, and I can't even remember when that was. It must have been like July, so well outside of the application window. And I was just like, hey, dude, I'm super interested in this thing called behavior analysis, specifically functional analysis of problem behavior. What do you know about it? And can I come work with you? And I think, man, it was a couple weeks later, I interviewed for the program, got an acceptance, and did my PhD with Tyra. And I've been serving, let's see here, I start my second year of postdoc at the Monroe Meyer Institute, or started it in July of this year. So that's kind of the short and sweet of my story.
Okay. I do love that our field is still small enough that you could have in your story. And then I cold called someone and they were like, sure, I'll hire you.
It might have been a cold email. I can't recall. But,
Send them a quick DM on Twitter. And there you go.
Yeah, I think you actually showed up at my house and it was a
Nice.
little awkward.
That's looked you up in a phone book, something like that.
That would be amazing.
Well, that sounds like a great journey. I kind of wish I had that. I feel like my story is never as much fun of like I was doing something fun and then I fell into behavior analysis. It's sort of just like I just want to quickly say, you said doing your outdoor stuff. And then I know before we were recording, Tyra mentioned some like rock climbing. So I take it you're like an outdoor hobbyist.
Yeah, I really liked the whole rock climbing thing. I was working for a climbing gym as I was, making my way through the final stages of my undergraduate, and for a little while after, thought about, possibly going into climbing guiding. But man, it is a tough industry, and it's really fun to do as a hobby, but it is not super fun to do as a job or a career path. So I'm pretty glad that I found behavior analysis, and I have way more fun with that than I did with climbing. So
I hope you still climb, though.
Oh, I do. Unfortunately, Monroe Meyer is in Nebraska, so I have to drive a long
many
way
mountains.
to climb.
It's a little flat.
Yeah, I think I can see you here from Denver, Seth, if I look east because it's
Tyra, I know.
So Tyra, what were you doing before this Seth Walker fellow, showed up at your doorstep looking for doctoral work?
I was working with other folks that were my doc students at Utah State University. So that was cool. It's not like I was, selling ice cream and he was like, hey, can I be your doc student? So that worked out well. Yeah, I was at Utah State University, which is actually where I also got my PhD. So I've been in the field for a little bit and tried to not have a career in this field, actually, because I went to law school thinking I would do special education advocacy or whatnot, but that didn't necessarily pan out. So a lot of clinical work, and then ended up in a position at Utah State University where I was lucky enough to have a couple of great doc students. And Seth actually was my last doc student that we finished up there. So that was pretty exciting.
Excellent.
Nice.
So we're going to be talking tonight about receiving feedback. Before I introduce the articles, is that this is a topic that both of you were interested in for a long time, have sort of come into more recently, think feedback's the best and want to research it for the rest of time. Where did kind of that genesis come from for feedback work?
I mean, for me, generally, feedback has always been very interesting to me, both in a practical sense and in terms of research, just because the general area that I'm very interested in is supervision and training, right? And then I also spent a number of years focusing on assessing and treating severe problem behavior, which on the practical side requires a lot of training of other individuals and use of feedback. So it's something that I have always been interested in. And Seth, I'm interested to hear your take on landing on this because I may have a different perspective. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, so again, similar to Tyra, when you're assessing and treating challenging behavior, oftentimes you're delivering a significant amount of feedback or ongoing feedback for your support staff. And that's been something that I've been especially interested in more recently, is the whole feedback. But yeah, more recent interest. And I thought, there's been so much on providing feedback. When I heard about the idea of maybe researching receiving feedback, man, that's kind of an interesting lens to take and an interesting approach. Can we teach people how to receive feedback better? And what are the impacts of that? Because I think everybody has had a scenario where they've delivered feedback and it's been received poorly. And we wonder, does that actually change behavior?
And then you ask, was that me?
Bad at feedback.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about our articles. We've got 3 that you sent over, one of which is written by 2 familiar faces, I think. We've got Teaching Employees How to Receive Feedback, a Preliminary Investigation by Ehrlich, Nozick, Carr, and Wine. from the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management in 2020.
I'm singing it in my head, by the way. I can't
What?
not.
2020?
Byron, we're watching you.
And then a follow-up.
Your every move.
Right? You can't
Yeah.
not. It's there now.
It's okay. He already knows.
He knows.
I think we sang it to him.
Yeah.
We serenaded him.
I did sing it to him.
Then we've got a follow-up by Walker and Sellers, teaching appropriate feedback reception skills using computer-based instruction, a systematic replication, also in the Journal of OBM, and that was in 2021.
That one sounds really good.
Mhm.
It sounds amazing.
It does.
It sounds like the best of
Just
the three.
title alone,
just
I
in
can't
case.
wait to read it.
And also identifying the relation between feedback preferences and performance by Bacardi, Brauerholz, Fisher, Morris, and Vollmer from 2021. It's an early print from Java.
These are all
Pre-print,
brand new.
whatever they call. I know.
I
This is
love
some
that.
I
up to
love
the
that.
minute. Up
We're
to
We're
the minute
cutting
research.
edge. We're
Yes.
cutting. We've got our finger right on the pulse.
So I guess that leads me to my very first question. Even before what is feedback, because we've talked about it a lot, we can come back and do some definitions. But feedback feels like one of those concepts that has been around forever and is recommended in all the major books. Yet when we look at feedback research, it still feels like that's a little bit more of kind of like a nascent field. Like everyone just decided they loved feedback and then years later said, you know what, maybe we should look into this feedback thing we've been talking about for all this time. Is that anyone else's sense, or am I just, I have some sort of a feedback research bias or something? I don't know.
No, I think that's actually absolutely right. In fact, there's an old article from, I don't know, like 1981 or 82 by Norman Peterson. And there used to be this section on terms, and that article basically is like, we're throwing around this term feedback, but we're not accounting for the mechanisms.
Right.
So, smart people were talking about that back in the early 80s, and we're still not quite woken up about it, I think.
It just feels very odd to be so, what was it, like the second most recommended technique for supervision or for improving staff in the OBM literature back in the 80s and 90s, and all this work about verbal feedback and even receiving feedback. I mean, I think when I was reading your article, reading at least the Ehrlich article, and they were discussing like, here were 8 ways that people want to receive feedback. And I'm like, I think they looked at the same Google website that someone wrote on a blog about here's how to receive feedback that I did like 15 years ago when I was starting to put training together for RBTs and paraprofessionals in public schools. It's very strange. I mean, what is it just a matter of it was a runaway train and everyone seemed to like feedback? They didn't want to ask why, or was it just no one was sure how to research it, or it's unclear?
Seth, what are your thoughts on that? I have a few ideas, but what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think first off, it's likely the easiest and most effective for, producing some behavior change across staff. And so just the fact that it is so accessible would lead to, it being applied across a number of certain circumstances. And yeah, I think there is, how should I say this? There's likely some failure in terms of consensus as to like the actual mechanism behind feedback. So yeah, I'll throw it back to you, Tyra. And sorry, that might make like the investigation of the mechanisms behind feedback a little bit more difficult. But I'll throw it back to you, Tyra, and hear what you have to say.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there are many things at play, probably some of which we're not going to be able to tackle. But I think like one global consideration is the fact that our science and our profession is still pretty young, and I think has been focused on discovering mechanisms related to, how do we effectively teach skills or maybe mitigate behavioral excesses for individuals primarily with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities. So it's been like a big area of focus. And I think just now the pendulum is sort of swinging like, hey, maybe all of the strategies that we've been using to affect all of these changes for these individuals, maybe those are kind of worth studying in and of themselves. And I think we are seeing more focus on studies looking at, the interveners, the implementers, and just cognitively intact adults in general, right? So how do we teach more efficiently? So we've had BST. It's called BST now. I think if you ask Ray Miltenberger, he would be like, that's just good training, right?
Yeah.
But once people sort of started naming it, then people started researching it. Now we kind of know, like, okay, feedback is a really critical component of BST. Maybe the role play practice part is really, really critical. Maybe you can do without the rationale. So I think similarly, we're starting to see more focus around feedback in and of itself in terms of what are the mechanisms. And it's sort of like this interlocking contingency, because you kind of can't talk about feedback giving without feedback receiving, because I could give feedback really well, but if it's heavily punished in terms of the behavior of the person who's listening, I'm not likely to do that again under similar circumstances. So I think at first there was this idea that, like, we need to figure out, like, what are the parameters of high quality feedback? And there has been some good work looking at timing and, length of utterance and, the order of your phrase versus corrective statements, stuff like that. So I think we're getting there. So, like, maybe don't beat the field up too much around it. But it is kind of shocking that we haven't made more progress. Oh, and I do think it is kind of hard to study. I think it gives this sort of like flowery smell that it would be really easy because we all do it and we do it a lot. And, we tell people to do it. But when you think about it, and I think some of these points were brought up in the Bacardi et al. Study that you mentioned, and they were sort of talking about, hey, look, I mean, there could be some ethical implications in terms of knowing that someone needs some support to change their, instruction or intervention with a client, but you're not giving them that feedback because you need your baseline. And that could be problematic. And, then it's not like we're giving feedback to rats whose histories we have controlled. Humans are varied, and we move through the world in a lot of different ways and come with all kinds of different histories. And so I think that's one of the reasons we'll start seeing more translational or analog studies around feedback, because you can control for those things. And then I think those applications will then be moved over into just straight up applied studies.
So in terms of getting into, I think, the Ehrlich article and then both of your replication, I know for me, when we were starting to kind of, prepare to chat with you about receiving feedback, I kind of thought back to, well, how did I first learn about feedback? That idea of, okay, someone's going to give me information about my performance, hopefully so I do a better job. And like you kind of already said, Tyra, so much work on feedback had to do with, as a supervisor, here's how to deliver feedback. And here's some tips on the best ways to give feedback. But I'd never really thought of receiving feedback as an individual skill related to the feedback loop. I'd sort of always lumped it into that kind of category of behaviors that made up, say, my professionalism. If I want to get ahead in the world, I better know how to take feedback. And I think like the kind of the 8 steps in the Ehrlich article, and then the 6 that you used in your replication, I was really sort of thinking about that. It's like, well, I want to make sure I look attentive. I don't want to argue. I want to say thank you so much for the feedback, no matter how rough it is to hear.
You don't want to cry or flip tables.
No, I don't want to be like, well, it's somebody else's fault, or I would have done it if you were a better trainer. I probably don't want to do that.
No, it's your fault.
But I never really thought of it as, oh, my verbal behavior might be punishing my supervisor to the point that they're like, whatever, I'll never give you feedback again. Because it always just felt like one of those skills that, like, no, you have to know how to receive feedback if you want to continue staying in a job. Like, it's irrelevant whether it works or whether you know how to do it well. It's just sort of part of staying employed. Was that an impression that you had as well? Or was it something that you've actually seen or potentially even felt firsthand that, like, well, I'm not going to give that person feedback. I don't like talking to that employee. And I know they're never going to get better because I don't want to give them feedback because they scare me, or their receipt of feedback is so aversive.
I personally have, sure, in my career. I mean, I've had people that, you give feedback and they get argumentative or they start crying. And especially early in my career when I was more concerned about, avoiding uncomfortable situations, I would be like, oh man, like how do I arrange the environment such that I don't have to give that person feedback? Seth, how about you? Have you been in that boat before?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this was more so a history of giving feedback to peers. Like, that's something that I've always found is an uncomfortable situation for me, just in general. But, you stack a couple of poor receptions on top of that, and man, that can become a very aversive experience pretty quickly. So, that's something that I thought about when we were kind of going into this study and doing some of the background research on it.
So when we look at the original Ehrlich article and then the replication, which came really quickly after that article, can you describe that sort of the timeline of how those two came together? Because it almost feels like you would have had to replicate almost the second, the research, the original Ehrlich research had been put in place just to kind of get it all out, especially because I know your article or your research sort of happened mid-COVID, like the worst of the pandemic.
Yes, definitely. This was actually my dissertation. So that was definitely the best dissertation experience I could have asked for, was having a global pandemic literally strike.
It can't get worse than that, Seth, right?
Yeah. So my career is all uphill from here. Or sorry, I don't know which up or downhill, but
sailing.
Smooth sailing. So unfortunately, in my second year in my doctoral program, Dr. Sellers took the director of ethics position at the BACB.
What do you mean, unfortunately? Wait a minute.
Because I didn't get to hang out with you for the last 2 years of my PhD program. Well, I did, for one. So that's part of the story. So she took off. I hung out for another year at Utah State. And then she turned me on to this fellowship opportunity at the BACB. And I jumped at the chance. And it wasn't working with Dr. Sellers, but I got to work with Dr. Nosek, who was excellent. And I learned so much from her there. But she is one of the authors on that Ehrlich paper. And so she turned me on to this idea of the feedback reception. We chatted a little bit about that in terms of just the applied implications of that study. And I thought, wouldn't that be cool to have something that was a uniform training that you could come in and implement across an entire organization to just get everybody on the same page in terms of how we want to establish our feedback culture within an organization. And so that was really kind of the origin of the study idea. And it was obviously fresh in Dr. Nosek's mind because that had just hit the publication, or that had just been published. And so, that's kind of the origin story of the replication.
Okay.
By the way, I totally acknowledge, Seth, that you said uniform, but I really heard unicorn. It was unicorn training.
Consistent uniform feedback training would be quite fun. Yeah. There's the extension. If you use unicorns within your computer-based training as like a visual,
or he shows up in a unicorn outfit.
Well, if you've ever been in one of Tyra's trainings, you will see a unicorn at least once.
Can confirm.
I'm trying to think back at some webinars. I know I've been in time. Like, was there?
Yeah.
Do I remember unicorns? I'm sure there was.
Unicorns and zombies.
Yep, typically.
The zombies I remember. I definitely remember, I want to say.
Well, the unicorns trample the zombies. Come on.
They come after the zombies.
Obviously.
The original paper, the Ehrlich paper, was looking at, like you said, Seth, can we just teach sort of a basic, here's how you receive feedback package? And they looked, I think they talked to some BCBAs. They looked at recent kind of just general best practice work on terms of like the 8 functions the 8 steps of receiving feedback. Just for our listeners, we should probably go over what did Ehrlich determine as the 8 steps of receiving feedback? Though I know there was some debate in the replication whether all 8 were necessary.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll actually have to pull up a note because I can't ever recall those off the top of my head.
I have them up in front of me.
Excellent. Thank you.
There was arriving prepared for the meeting, maintaining eye contact during the meeting, ask appropriate follow-up questions, acknowledges corrective feedback, engages in active listening, commits to behavior change, indicates appreciation for the feedback, and demonstrates appropriate overall demeanor. And then there were sort of rationale and further descriptions, like arriving prepared for the meeting was, having a writing utensil and a notepad so that you could take notes during.
And then demeanor was just generally like you didn't look angry, or you didn't do the I'm crossing my arms and checking my phone repeatedly kind of during the meeting.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you called that one out. I think that often we're sort of like, we can't talk about things like positive affect or demeanor or those sorts of things. But, I think it is pretty easy for us to come up with, and I think Seth did a pretty great job in his dissertation of trying to come up with some operational indicators of what would be considered appropriate demeanor or, active listening, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because with something like receiving feedback, you're like, well, I don't really know how I'm going to define that, right? You automatically think that seems outside of the realm of something that we could break down. But then when you see the steps, it all makes sense. And it is something we can pretty easily operationally define. And I thought the authors did a good job in both studies.
Mm-hmm. I know, and certainly it was in the replication. And I was sort of glad that you got rid of some of those steps, like coming prepared to the feedback session.
Right.
I think,
they were saying it's so short, right? Yeah.
It is. And oftentimes those feedback sessions that you may have are informal or unplanned. And so the fact that you might not have a writing utensil to take notes on the feedback you receive is very likely, right? So that was actually one of the ones that we chatted about pretty extensively, in a normal feedback situation, like when you are receiving feedback either informally or, in passing or stopping by somebody's office to have a brief feedback meeting, the likelihood that you're actually taking notes on the feedback which you receive is minimal. And then the fact that the fact that you might not be able to recall the feedback you receive in a 2 to 3 minute meeting is very unlikely as well. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things where we said, maybe all of these skills aren't necessary to receive feedback well. Mm-hmm. And that kind of led to the 6 steps that were replicated in our study.
Now, I was surprised that you got rid of was it the appreciative statement of the feedback? That was not in the replication. Because I know for me, I live for the appreciative statement when I'm receiving feedback. Like, it's my target. It's like, I know at the end I'm going to say thank you so much for this, and that's what's going to keep me from going into like bad patterns of behavior. Like, what do you mean I didn't do a good job? Or what do you mean it's somebody else's fault? Or like, I don't have to sit here and take this. It's like, just get to the thank you. Just get to the thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback.
You can take this job.
And it was also in like every sort of like resource I looked into, way back in the day, was very much like, always make sure to end with that appreciative statement of feedback. Does that date me? Is that like, that's like old man feedback receipt research? I got to stop telling my supervisees to tell me thank you when I'm done giving the feedback.
Well, I would actually suggest that you continue to tell your supervisees to thank you after your feedback, but some of those things are not very typical in a modern day working environment. Like, it may be, okay, I'll see you later, or I'll see you next week, something like that, rather than like, hey, thank you so much for the feedback that you just gave me. So there were some, and this is anecdotally, some conversations that Dr. Nosik and I had about the utility of that thank you statement, and some other responses that they may have seen in that prior study that may have been very similar to that appreciative statement. Mm-hmm. But we'll see you later. Hey, thanks for your time. That one is actually an appreciative statement. But yeah, that was some of the evidence that we used to take that step out and actually just pursue it without the appreciative statement.
But I think part of it also, Seth, was those were the 2 that you dropped were the 2 that occurred at low frequency in the original study anyway. So clearly, this was an opportunity to pull out a couple things and see, do you still get good effects if you don't have these other components? And I do think that kind of like committing to behavior change, like, okay, I'm gonna work on this. Thanks for letting me know, kind of did incorporate that appreciative statement for most of the people that were receiving feedback.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you might not be in a position to give that appreciative at the end, right? Like you might sound, I know I've tried to not sound like mad when someone's like, you're doing a bad job. Do better. And I'm like, thank you so much for that. But I sound mad, so I have to say something else. Right? Like,
oh, well, thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Right, like it could sound different, right? Depending on the emotional effects. And what I've found in clinical work is that when supervisors send that written feedback, right, so that the person doesn't have to write down, but if the supervisor follows up with that written feedback, that gives you a little more space to then appreciate the statement, right? So then after I'll write like an email back, like, oh, thanks so much for sending this. I'm going to work on it, right? Because I've had time to get all my emotional responding out of the window. So then I can be more appreciative.
I say I'm the master of the like put my hand on my chin and go, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I feel like it always seems genuine. Diana will tell you that I look so fake. I'm not genuine at all. She's mouthing right now. I am. I do appreciate the feedback. It means that you care about my abilities. It's nice. Thank you.
But I also do think it's important for us to like put this in the context of like we're all sort of culturally contracting that this is the list of things that we do when we give and receive feedback. So this could vary culture to culture.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so, all of the researchers are looking observationally at what typically occurs in the context of a feedback meeting or what those expectations are. And it makes sense that upon viewing what did or did not occur that you modified it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of being laid out there like a TA, right? Like this is what we're going to, in our culture, this is the expectation, right? Of how one would receive feedback, but it could certainly
in Western
vary.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to Jackie's point, I appreciate that you made that point, and I think if we think about like the feedback sandwich, like say something nice, give the corrective feedback, say something nice, really. I mean, and the research is varied, right? For some people that works, for other people it doesn't. But to your point, Jackie, if it's sort of like, hey, I love your shirt. By the way, you're doing this wrong. I need you to do it completely differently. And you smell really great, right? So if it's disingenuous, it's problematic. And frankly, I think that sometimes when we're manualizing things, people can take it that way, right? They can just read this and say, make an appreciative statement. And that statement might be like, thanks so much for the feedback. Like that's not the point of making an appreciative statement.
Right. Mm-hmm. And in the moment, you may not be able to. So I'm actually really glad you took that out because you can get it other ways. And the supervisee keeps coming back too, which could be reinforcing for the supervisor.
Yeah, definitely.
It's part of my own personal chain of behaviors to not scream at anyone when I'm receiving feedback. So I guess that's me. That's an individual blip on the.
No, I totally do the same thing. Like I will say like, hey, thank you so much for taking the time and giving me this feedback. You've given me a lot to think about. So I do that, but that's just my flavor of how I receive feedback.
Thank you, Tyra. Yeah, I feel like you've normalized my own feedback.
It's the meeting, right?
It ends the meeting.
It does end the meeting.
Like,
and anyway, I gotta go.
I am done taking feedback now. I'm getting out of here.
It's Miller time. Gotta get out of here.
I don't know. Mine might be like a softened man for like, okay, I said thank you. Now I want you to say thank you back.
At least you know the function, right?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Hate to jump in and interrupt the conversation mid-flow, but I did want to remind you all that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to this episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, that's GET-CEUS, and enter in some information, including 2 secret code words we've hidden in the episode. I'm going to tell you the first one now, and this is from our guests. We have 2 secret code words. That first one, pomegranate. Pomegranate. It's a fruit. You don't eat the fruit. You eat the seeds inside. I don't know if anyone's actually had pomegranate seeds. They're kind of tough to eat. I prefer a pomegranate juice. You get those remember that was like hot really for a while, right? Pomegranate. Anyway, pomegranate. And now, before we get to that conversation, why don't we take a really quick break? Then we'll be right back talking with Dr. Sellers and Dr. Walker about receiving feedback.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we're back talking with Dr. Sellers and Dr. Walker about receiving feedback. Let's jump back into that conversation, shall we? So in both studies, the format of the training, and we'll talk about, looked different. But generally, there was a task, and they were, your classic sort of OBM research email or filling out form tasks that needed to be done, and feedback was delivered on those tasks. And the format, I loved this, the format of the giving feedback sort of took kind of a little bit of a scripted response, because otherwise, how could you guarantee that you had a chance to have those 8 or 6 kind of receipt components come through? My favorite being the general statement of feedback. So there was sort of that opening for, and here's where you say, oh, could you please give me more information about what it is you're talking about? Because I know that's one that I've seen in the how do you receive feedback? Like, don't ask questions unless they are clarifying questions, which to me always meant I'm never going to ask a question ever, no matter how confusing the feedback is, for fear of making my manager angry at me. In practice, did that feel more natural, or was it more natural than I think I'm making it sound?
I think the more unnatural component of that feedback delivery was delivering the vague feedback.
Yeah.
So, we're so trained, and it's so ingrained in our training to deliver behavior, like a specific feedback, like as objective and specific as possible. So delivering feedback like, your email just wasn't that good, dude. That felt so weird to say. And that actually helped me pause a little bit, because I was like, yeah, that was terrible feedback. You need to give them an opportunity to clarify so you can actually deliver some good feedback.
But Seth, you didn't stop yourself in the middle of the experiment. Say, I'm sorry, I have to say that again. I did
sorry, that. Yeah. No, I didn't stop myself, but yeah.
Seth, do you remember us practicing these in my office? Because we both were like, how are you going to do this? How are you going to make a vague statement? How are you going to make this pause without like it seeming like this big pregnant pause that, was very clear what you were doing? And when we like had to practice a couple of times to get it right, it was weird.
Yeah. It was basically just us giggling and snickering for 30 minutes.
It's true.
And we finally figured it out. So.
With the final, was it like this email, good, or like no.
Yeah, deep sigh.
Wow.
So you had kind of that scripted response, so that there was an opportunity for the individuals to engage in the 8 or 6 steps, and then training. And so with the original Ehrlich study, it was sort of more we think of as BST. But Seth, in yours and Tyra's study, you decided, no, thank you. I ain't got time for BST. We're going into a computer-based instruction. Now, was that something that you're like, for my dissertation, I don't care what I'm doing, computers will be involved, or it just felt like it lent itself well to the research question?
Yeah, I thought it went itself quite well to the research question, but I've always been a fan of technology in training and in behavior analysis.
Nerd.
Yep, nerd. There we go. I've had a couple of experiences developing some computer-based trainings at Utah State under Tyra, and man, those were cool experiences. Although I will say, if anybody is interested in doing that, just get ready to be absolutely sick of the sound of your own voice.
Yeah.
I'm sure you guys know that too.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
100%.
It quickly becomes one of the most aversive things. So after you get over that, it kind of, you get a little bit more used to it and it's not so bad. But yeah, so computer-based training was something that I was definitely interested in, and it seemed to align fairly well with the approach that we were considering taking. So.
But to be clear, your computer-based training did include behavioral skills training components, right? So it wasn't like you didn't implement what we know to be one of the most evidence-based, heavily researched training packages. You just delivered it in this other way, which really gets at that whole, is it helpful to organizations to be able to have this complex skill you're trying to teach, but an efficacious way of doing it, so that you're, you don't have your HR person re-delivering this training every 2 weeks because turnover is so intense in our profession.
Yeah, exactly. And so we were basing it off of that standard behavior skills training approach. And it seems to be that computer-based training is a solid solution to especially those high turnover positions, to training in those high turnover positions like your behavior technician roles or your customer service roles, where you do see folks frequently leaving those positions and being hired on. So
Seth, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what components you wanted to use in the computer-based instruction, and then sort of like generally what it did end up looking like. Because I do always find when I read about computer-based instruction, and you certainly described it very well in the paper, but it is so hard to sort of imagine, what did this look like? It's like there were videos, and the videos showed, accurate performance, and they showed some inaccurate, and there was a data sheet that the participant was, scoring what was done correctly, what wasn't done correctly, and we did feedback on that. It is kind of still hard to imagine, no matter how well it's written, like, what does that actually look like? If I were to like say, you know what, I'm going to replicate this tomorrow, how hard would that be, given it's just, we're talking about, a visual medium that just, there's no way to capture it all, and, the paragraph that you get for your research paper.
Right. Yeah. So first off, imagine firing up a computer and the screen illuminates. No.
I was like, I'm going, what a journey we're going on.
Oh, man. All right. So everybody's been through that voiceover slideshow, and that's always a component of, in my computer-based instructions that I do, I like to keep some things simple. And so that instruction phase of it, typically that is just my voice over slides, possibly some video examples embedded in that. And then we'll go into some sort of discrimination task where we're either watching a video example, answering some, multiple choice questions that are embedded throughout that PowerPoint. And those, basically check that folks are still attending to the content and that they can accurately discriminate something that is going on, or some terminology that we're presenting throughout that phase. Sorry.
Side note, I want to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
So talk to you later.
All right. Sounds cool. Yeah.
Keep people awake during your trainings, Jackie, is what you want?
Basically.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where, we would progress to a practice scenario. And so the practice scenario and the automating feedback was kind of interesting. I luckily had the help of a great couple of actors in our building. And so we recorded probably an hour of these mock feedback scenarios of crazy different variety, and with multiple different types of error patterns, that basically every combination of error pattern that you could exhibit with those 6 skills, the presence or absence of them in video form. And I had my treatment fidelity sheet that I was going to, or my fidelity sheet that I was going to be using to score our main dependent variable, our primary dependent variable. And essentially what I did was I had that superimposed on the screen with a side-by-side video, and they could go through the video and score that sheet as it occurred after we had explained all of those skills and exactly what kind of comprised each step of that skill or each score of that skill. And then based on their error patterns, we had kind of stock feedback that would display on the screen after that. So that's the general gist of that preparation, and that was across all 6 of those skills.
That sounds like a lot of work.
And it took. I think you even mentioned, like, when you're talking about the return on investment of the computer base, it was like, what was it, 25, 35 hours?
About 45.
45. I'm sorry, I'm undercutting how much work it took. Apologies.
Yeah. But in the whole, proportion of dissertation time, that's a very small drop in the bucket. So
true. And now you may be able to use it forever.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And you never have to fix it again.
45 hours per one single skill times how many skills?
For life. Because you'll never update it.
Right, which sounds like a lot, but then you have to balance it against, if you're a big organization, how much time are you spending with onboarding new folks and teaching the same skills multiple times per year? That adds up a lot too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of where we got into that return on investment analysis. We'd spoken a little bit about that Geiger and LeBlanc paper that looked at the computerized instruction versus the BST, I believe. And that's a cool analysis that I think should be included in most studies where we're, investigating a computerized application or comparing that to an in vivo training, because we want to know, should I actually invest in this? Is this do I have the right input into the system in terms of number of staff that we're hiring and output in terms of number of staff that are leaving and overall frequency in which I'm implementing these trainings to justify the cost of creating this computerized instruction? Because it's not an easy task, even when you're used to it. But for folks who are not used to developing a computerized instruction module, that can definitely increase that initial investment time. So if you're learning as you're going, it can be, it can inflate those hours.
And so in Dr. Nozick's research, there was sort of more what we think of as sort of the in-person BST, whereas in your Dr. Sellers paper, it was the module based on those same principles. I don't believe, was there any contact other than the feedback delivery later on, sort of in that post-training that occurred, or everything, they learned it all in the context of the module until they reached their accuracy targets?
Yeah, I mean, this was just a one-dose training, if that's what you're asking. So
yes.
It was kind of that they sat down, they took the training, and, I was there for support, either in person or via phone later on. And that was it. It was the easiest intervention I've implemented.
Best dissertation ever.
To develop, but the actual implementation time was very light. So prep work, not so much.
And results in both studies were great in terms of the receiving feedback skills, except for, we talked about 2 that didn't seem to get mastered: the prepared bring your pencil to a feedback session and the appreciative statements. But other than that, it seemed that everyone reached mastery pretty quickly. There was a moderate improvement in the skill itself. I think there was a PR form, or not a PR form, some sort of form for one participant, and then there was an email checking tasks for a lot of the other participants. So overall good results. And then I believe only your study had the social validity score for, did the participants like the intervention itself? And it kind of looked like some mixed results in terms of your 3 participants.
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, they were fairly favorable. There were some mixed results in terms of, and, I think having feedback reception skills taught to you, there are always those times where you would sit in and, maybe get feedback or go through a training on some sort of professionalism, and you may feel like you don't need that training. That may have been the case here with some of those individuals who took part in the training. I see what they want me to do, but I don't think I really needed to be told to make good eye contact when I'm receiving feedback. That's just something that, I typically do when I'm talking to other human beings. So
I do wonder, Seth, how did you modify that when you had to switch it to Zoom? Because sometimes I am actually just looking at myself.
I'm actually always looking at myself. Let's be honest.
That's a great question. Yeah. And so that one was a little bit more, well, I don't know. It was more so that orientation toward the screen. I am likely the only moving, talking stimulus on their screen at that point in time with the Zoom call open. So we would look for that orientation toward the screen and toward the camera.
Yeah. And I mean honestly, I kind of like that it might be a little bit more forgiving in that way as well. So that if someone weren't comfortable making eye contact, then at least they're just oriented toward the speaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, we always talk about how weird eye contact is if you're making it constantly or toward another individual. So that's something where, there is a little bit of leeway, Yeah. So
cool. Thank you for answering.
Having scored several of the videos, it was interesting because I sort of had the same concern, like, is this going to be really hard? But watching the videos, the participants were so engaged. Like they were so pumped about their interaction. Well, at least they appeared to be their interaction around getting this feedback and moving forward with their tasks, that it was actually really easy to score that, they were clearly attending to Seth and not, looking at some other place in the room, off camera, that sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And that eye contact kind of overlapped a little bit with that active listening component. So, and you guys just did a little bit of that right there. But when you hear those, subtle indications that folks are actually attending to what you're talking about or, telling them, we definitely did see that, like good eye contact and active listening oftentimes coincided. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of the skills that improved, because I know things like eye contact and demeanor were had already maxed out in baseline in terms of your scoring. Where did you see the biggest growth in terms of the receiving feedback list of skills?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones was that commitment to behavior change. And that was more of a binary variable. So like it was either there or it wasn't. Like, right, I'm going to do this in the future, or I see where I went wrong there. This is how I'm going to, fix that moving forward. So that was definitely one of the big ones. Yeah, I think that was one of the most noticeable ones for me personally throughout the study. Tyra, you helped on some of the scoring. Did you notice anything else that was a significant change in the participants?
I think that there was a change over time with that active listening, to be honest with you, like a little bit, sort of like giving a little bit more to you as you were giving them their feedback or walking them through the task, but definitely being specific follow-up question and the commitment to change. So a lot of times the follow-up question might sort of say like, well, like, okay.
I do remember a couple of okays and I was like, oh goodness, this is awkward now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think asking that specific follow-up question improved significantly, which I think anecdotally is one of those things that could be linked to our ability to kind of be better learners in the future. Like if we get good at asking those follow-up questions, because sometimes your trainer, your supervisor, they don't know what you don't know. But if you can sort of learn to say like, you know what, I hear you and I want to get better at this. I'm still missing something. Can you tell me specifically, was it this? Or I'm still not sure I understand. Was it that I wasn't fast enough? And I think learning how to ask those clarifying questions is so critical. So there needs to be more research around that, I think, that specific component of the package, because I think that's such an important thing. And I also kind of think it's empowering to teach people, like you should question your trainer, your supervisor, right? You should be asking them specific questions.
I do like that statement, empowering, Tyra, because I know when I've given people feedback in the past, when they ask those follow-up questions, it does feel like I'm so glad I gave you this feedback, because you clearly care and you're signaling to me that you want to learn. And maybe you're even asking like, oh, could you show me, or could you model that for me? Or I'd love to see that again. Or could you come observe me again? It definitely does make the giving of more feedback in the future more likely. Just that good follow-up question and the sense, especially when you also feel like I taught them to ask that good follow-up question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also guards against this. My partner in life, Adam, who is literally the loveliest human in the entire world, but he's very skilled at just repeating the same question when I don't understand what he's saying. And so I think I have had to get good at this, because I sort of have to, I can't just say like, I don't understand, because he'll just sort of say the same thing again, or maybe slightly louder. So, learning to ask very specific questions back guards against that. And I think it's a way of it's a demand for more information. And as a trainer, we can then attend to that and say like, oh my gosh, yeah, I see what you're asking now. I wasn't clear, or I left that piece out, or I didn't have that context. And so it's basically like giving feedback to the feedback giver. Hey, it's kind of meta, or I don't know what's happening, but it's just a cool thing and everybody should do it.
Very nice. So when it comes down to looking at receiving feedback as a skill, it's well, I mean, at least of the, I think six total participants, it seemed to be a very teachable skill. It did have it did lead to some improvement in the carrying out of at least these very simple kind of rote tasks that the employees were carrying out, the email checking or the form checking. I do like in the discussion how you sort of point out, like, this seems like a very simple way to teach feedback for very simple skills. But perhaps, thinking about receiving feedback, I don't know, almost like a cusp for other behavior, like we talked about, that demand for more information, or that, getting more, the motivation of, now I'm going to attend more of your trainings, or I'm going to be paying more attention to my supervisor talking to me or showing me a new skill, that it just seemed like it could potentially lead to more in the organization. So it really sort of being like that small seed that bears great fruit down the road, especially when everyone's going to get feedback and everyone's going to have to receive feedback at some point. There?
Yes.
Yeah, I know. I was like, where did my question go? Sorry.
Question.
No, I just made a big statement. I love that discussion. That's not a question, Professor. Sorry about that.
Monologuing.
But I guess, the question that would come from my long statement there is, where do you see this being of most use, and sort of, do you see this sort of being able to be a component of teaching those more complex skills? Because that's really the big research question. Like, it's great that we now are better at our email skills and receiving feedback, but I work in an organization that provides direct care to, really young children or individuals with significant disabilities. I need to know, is this going to be a good use of my time? Because I might not have those 45 hours to put together. I definitely don't have the time to do the direct training, but I might not even have the 45 hours for my, computer-based modules. So what's left to learn? Or we don't seem to know everything. How are we going to get to those answers?
I might have to have you clarify that again. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
I think, Rob, you're trying to ask.
Please tell me what I'm trying to say, because I clearly do not know.
Are there additional benefits from teaching this type of skill that you could potentially anticipate for your trainees?
That's exactly what I said. Thank you, Diana.
Yeah.
I just said it in 95% fewer words.
So one of the things that Tyra and I had talked about kind of throughout this process was establishing a feedback-rich environment in organizations. And part of that is, the behavior of that listener, and how that perpetuates a particular response class of, the speakers. So giving feedback is that target response that we're looking for. And that doesn't persist unless we have, adequate support for that in the environment, those listeners or that audience. And so, teaching that feedback reception skill may not only just help that person be more pleasant to work with, or, empower them to ask more questions about their job and respond to feedback in a more appropriate way, or have small increases in particular work tasks that they're required to do, but it might produce overall greater rates of feedback from supervisory personnel or management staff. And that's one thing where, if you can teach this skill across a number of individuals who are support staff, that may increase the likelihood that you have managers delivering consistent quality feedback to all of those folks, which is a situation that we really want, especially in large human service organizations.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Seth. I think if you could arrange studies to capture whether or not the person receiving feedback, when they learned to receive feedback well, if you could capture whether or not that produced an overall increase in feedback delivery from the people that were giving them feedback, right? So essentially, are you shaping up the feedback givers' behavior because they're contacting more reinforcing, richer experiences when they're delivering feedback? So can you somehow get at they are then increasing their frequency, particularly of discretionary feedback, right? Like, so we have structured observation times, but are they giving more feedback when they aren't necessarily expected to? And then I wonder sometimes, does this produce an increase in individuals who learn how to receive feedback well? Does this increase the likelihood that they will solicit feedback? Will they ask for feedback more?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. That would be good to know. Just in terms of always wanting to have a workforce that is, a part of the long-term change and improvement plan of your organization. And I think that's soliciting. I mean, I think we all have worked with those individuals who are always soliciting feedback, and, they tend to go on to be the leaders in the organization. And some people don't. And you wonder, is it because they've just had such a bad learning history when it comes to asking for feedback, just leading to being told what a bad job they're doing, or putting them in a position where they feel they have no choice but to not receive the feedback as well as we might want them to, or we might suggest they do.
Yeah. And sometimes I wonder, even looking at a preparation similar to what Seth did, but having a condition where the feedback giver ends with, thank you so much for receiving this feedback so well. I really appreciate whatever, right? And does it increase sort of the feedback contingency loop that's happening, or the reinforcement loop that's happening? And then, you have, again, both individuals getting reinforced for engaging in this back and forth or sort of chained behavior.
Yeah.
Now, we don't need to spend as much time on it, but we also had kind of, mentioned we were going to talk a little bit about the Bacardi article in terms of the feedback preferences. I thought this was a really interesting translational article, though it did sort of, I think, answer a question that I sort of assumed was going to be the answer, that people like to get feedback at certain times in the learning process. And unsurprisingly, it did seem that in terms of time, people preferred feedback when it was closer to the response, when they were learning a new skill. And then as time went on and they mastered the skill, feedback they preferred the feedback being delivered to them with a little bit more distance.
Yeah. This study blew my mind, because I was just like, yes, this makes so much sense. But like, I've always been told it has to be like immediately after the response. And there are some studies that show that some folks prefer and perform better if they're getting pre-session feedback. Like, hey, Jackie, don't forget, you're working on whatever, clearing the table after every response or what have you. And so, to me, this is just like such a clever arrangement, getting at such really cool information. And it makes sense, right? Like, as I'm learning something, I want to know right away. But once I'm kind of in my groove and I'm getting fluent, like, don't disrupt me. Don't throw a wrench in the machine.
Yeah, I mean, the outcome did seem obvious once you got to it, but this research is still needed. There's so much we don't know about feedback and its delivery. So it's good to do this type of work, and like you were saying, Tyra, having it done in the translational realm can help to hopefully answer some of these questions in a way that can then be applied, to a more clinical or application setting. But I really just loved the graphic that they made, where it looked like the little beads of the different activities. I thought the picture of the graphic program display of how they taught the skill was really cool.
That brought me back to undergraduate extra credit research day. So not that one.
Not that one. Sorry, this is going to translate really well on our audio podcast.
Well, I like the vision of what the computer screen looked like in learning my sort of arbitrary complex discrimination task. It was the original task they did.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's one of those kind of funny papers of, we're all saying, yeah, those results, that kind of seems like how people like feedback. But I guess it does point to maybe just there's something about feedback that it just feels so simple. Like, why would we research? Why do we ask these questions? Feedback, it's great, it works, and that's all we need to know. But there could have been different results, and not all of the participants did follow that pattern of, I get feedback. I want feedback right away. I prefer it when it's given to me when I'm learning a new task, and then like you said, back off, dude. I got this one. I know the square goes with the number 5 or whatever the task was they were doing.
Yeah, I think with these sorts of studies, similar to, there's a great study by Flo DeGeneres-Reed and colleagues where they were kind of looking at the feedback sandwich. And, a lot of times it really is participant specific. And I think I fangirl hard over Florence DeGeneres-Reed, big time.
Same.
Oh, yeah.
Same.
One thing that she says, and I think it's probably via Scott Geller or something like that, but, just ask people. You can just ask. You can say, like, hey, Seth, I've got, some stuff I want to tell you that was stellar about your performance, and I have 2 things that I want us to work on. Which do you want me to tell you first? Like, you literally can just hand over control and ask the other human across from you what they prefer, and then arrange the feedback in that way.
Sort of do you want the good news or the bad news? Exactly. Sort of. It's kind of a loaded question, though, I think, if you ask that nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you say good and bad news.
Right. That's constructed by a verbal community, Rob.
I've got 2 pieces of bad news. Which bad news do you want first?
Right. Do you want the really bad news or the catastrophically bad news?
It's all relative. We recently gave a survey like this to some of the folks that we work with to ask them how would they like to receive feedback. And it was really interesting to see the variation in responses. Some people said they hardly ever want even good feedback, and some people said they want it every time that they see someone, and some people wanted it right away, and some people wanted it later in email form. So it was really interesting to see the differences. So we should not assume that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. It's definitely going to be idiosyncratic. I do think it is also a relevant area to determine if folks' identified preferences for feedback are actually the most effective way for them to receive feedback.
100%. And I love that you all did that with your staff. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
That came out of my ABA training and supervision class.
Good job, Jackie.
Because we were like, oh, look, this is best case that we should be doing. We should be doing this, by the way.
Research to practice.
Yeah. I was just sending my PowerPoints to the directors.
Well, see, I really wanted them to add in the no feedback, because they'd have little baseline sessions, and then they'd have the little do your little computer task, and it would say, what kind of feedback do you want to get? And then I guess the researcher was standing behind them the whole time and would give them feedback or not. I really wanted them to look at, did anyone choose if the option was no feedback? Because they took that option out. I kind of want to see, does anyone say no feedback or just like, no, I'm going to white knuckle it through this arbitrary clicky task. No thanks, I'm good, I got this. Like they just want to figure it out.
Because they took it out of the arrangement.
Yeah, when they were finally looking at, when they sort of were looking at the kind of the concurrent chains sort of setup, it was you could get like right away or wait a little while. I forget the phrasing. Correct, after the trial, after the whole session. But no, they didn't give them the option, which I mean, they explain makes sense because you can't necessarily have a job where you have the option of like, no thanks, boss, don't want to hear about it. I'm sure it was great.
La 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 la.
But I kind of want that to be almost like a hiring question. Like, how do you like your feedback? I don't take feedback.
No, thank you.
It was so great to meet you. Please don't let the door hit you on the way out. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, even just hearing you, Jackie, describe that some people were like, I don't even want to hear the good stuff. I kind of feel like in practicality, like, is that really true? Like, weird flex. I don't know about that.
It's true. We don't know.
No.
We don't know how that's going to pan out.
Right. There was also a previous history of supervision. I think there was too much supervision happening, like too much feedback being delivered. So I think that specific individual may have been satiated on feedback within like the in the moment clinical settings. We didn't make it anonymous, so we knew who it was.
Yeah, and everyone's coming in with their own history,
right?
Right, which is why you might get idiosyncratic responding as well. And I always try to be upfront with the folks that I supervise too, that like it is definitely a feedback loop here, right? Like I'm a person in this relationship just like you are, and there are some aspects of providing feedback that are more challenging, just as it may be more challenging in some ways for you to receive feedback. So I try to be upfront with people too about what my typical feedback style is, which is so subtle, because when I receive feedback, I'm so sensitive to it that I want to be respectful if someone is like me, that I'm not just hitting them over the head with something that they, knew through intuition by looking at my face. But not everyone's like that, right? So I try to have a conversation with someone when I'm first entering into that relationship with them to get a feel for what kind of feedback recipient they might be, so I can tailor the way that I provide feedback to meet their needs.
I think that's right on. And folks that work with you are lucky. If anything, the collective body of research around feedback delivery and to some degree feedback reception is that it is highly specific to the individual. And so the idea, again, that we just learn this formula for giving feedback and then we follow that is not going to produce, I think, optimal results. I think it has to be bidirectional. I think you as a supervisor have to be flexible. You have to be willing to, for example, I tend to use a lot of sarcasm, but I have worked with people where they're like, I have trouble understanding sarcasm, or sarcasm is really aversive to me. And I have to work hard. Like, I don't just say, well, too bad for you. Right. You have to change your behavior. So so I think that feedback needs to be bidirectional in two ways. It should be bidirectional, meaning it flows both ways. I give feedback and you give me feedback, but also it should be function altering. Like, my feedback changes your behavior and your feedback changes my behavior.
Oh, so good.
Have you ever been stuck in a situation where you couldn't turn the sarcasm off and you were sort of like, no, please tell me all about how you like your feedback?
No. But it would be funny if we were in a supervision experience, because I wouldn't pick up on the sarcasm because I never do.
No, you're not a sarcasm picker-upper?
Nope. And so I'm just like, well, I will tell you. And then I'll go on. And I just don't, it's not one of my forces.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I will tell you all about it. It's one of my weaknesses, is I never pick up sarcasm. So I just go with it, much to the listener, I guess.
Well, I think we're getting to a point where we're going to move into our dissemination station. Wow, Jackie, your sound effects keep getting better every episode.
I know, thank you. I've been watching that commercial on the TV. I think I don't know, but the kid goes away to college. Do you remember this?
Any commercial where a kid goes to college, I cry.
No, it's a train, and then she gets on the train. Sad. It's like a life insurance commercial.
Oh yeah.
And like the kid goes away, and the train is going, and the mom is crying, and it's like, did you get life insurance?
Oh, that's terrifying. I don't like that.
I cry every time I watch this commercial.
Very heavy-handed.
Yes, but the train sound is amazing.
So you've been modeling.
I'm trying to listen to it.
Yep.
Get a coic.
I thought it was really good this time.
Thank you. Practicing.
Really good.
Again, so thank you.
So we've got some answers to kind of what goes into feedback. Certainly looking at how can we best use our time, maybe using computer-based models to teach the skill of receiving feedback. We know it is a skill that can be taught and can lead to some improvements. We have some sense of, okay, here are some general ideas of timing, but maybe the bigger statement being, you can ask people how they like to get their feedback, and then they will probably, might shift their behavior to, receive that feedback that way, or to ask for that feedback or request that feedback. But I think kind of our big questions are, all right, so we've got some information here. How are we going to start exploring this outside the context of the simple tasks? Because like Tyra, you mentioned here, and it's mentioned in the articles, it's not so easy to set up this exact experiment, but doing it with, say, direct care staff. Because, who's doing their baseline where you're like, I needed 5 sessions for them to just do a terrible job working with this individual before I was going to tell them, actually, just the worst so far. So here's how you're going to receive feedback. How are we going to translate some of these principles? Is it more just in the, well, we have some ideas of how feedback works, so let's just keep delivering it that way and just look at that kind of the byproduct of feedback in terms of the improvement in skill? Are these questions that we should be just looking in the lab to kind of find some of the mechanisms and then sort of hope it works in real life to get over some of the ethical quandaries? Kind of what's next, or how do we get over some of these barriers?
Robert, I don't know.
Well, Tyra, come on, you have to give me something.
That's what Dissemination Station is all about.
I think it's a little bit of everything that you're saying. I think that practitioners out there, I think that you all should be taking a structured approach to finding out what your folks like in terms of feedback delivery. Maybe you start keeping an eye on how your folks receive feedback. Maybe you're just taking some data in your notes from your supervision meetings or your training meetings or what have you, and then try changing things subtly and see how it works. So, I really think for a lot of us in the applied world, it's just going to be that sort of practitioner researcher model where, maybe we're not going to have a baseline, but we have our status quo, and we can be mindful and, collect some general data and try to make some positive improvements. I think in the research setting, I think the translational model and analog sort of applications will be really great for a while, but there are a couple of studies out there, and I'm going to blank on the names, but there are a few of them that were comparing sort of like in vivo feedback to distance feedback with like bug and ear. And I think maybe using bug and ear technology can help get away from some of the sort of like, social issues with feedback delivery, because you can just be like whispering it right inside someone's head. So I think there's that. And then honestly, and I hope there are not too many haters out there, this might be the kind of thing we have to just branch out of single subject design and maybe do some research in some group design. That's not my area of expertise. I can't even believe I'm saying that, but it feels like this could be the right kind of application, or maybe sort of a 1-2, right? Like you do a study like Seth did with a couple of participants, you kind of refine everything. You've got your materials. Now you take the 2 clinics that you happen to have and you run some easy group design. I don't know.
I love that.
That's not sacrilege. You're not going to take my qualification.
We're ands. I think behavior analysis has to be like a single subject design and group design, right? If we're ever going to break through to everyone else in the world, I think we have to use what we know, but then we also have to see if it works for everyone, right? Because we can't wait another 35 to 40 years to say, oh yeah, this works now, look, right? We just don't have that kind of time in the kind of climate that we're in, I think.
Yeah. Seth, what do you think about sort of what next steps might be to get this going?
Yeah, I definitely think that, feedback is something that everybody is using all the time. And so I think the possibility for any sort of subtle manipulation in applied scenarios is there. And it's probably good practice to take a look at your feedback and how that's impacting your supervisees just in general. But that's got to provide some inspiration for a research question at some point in time. And so I think that a lot of these questions are going to be derived from our clinical practice and our experiences in the field to really identify those next questions too. So very similar to Tyra's thoughts on it. Like, I think we're just going to be generating those ideas from our practice.
All right. So some future directions. So we can't just keep saying feedback. It's magic. Don't worry about it. We probably have to.
It's magic.
Yeah.
Feedback. Oh, that was good.
Remember when we first learned about feedback and it just seemed like it just magically worked? Oh, those are the days. Now we got to research it.
Now we have to understand all the behavioral mechanisms. What a drag.
Curse our human brains. We just don't let anything sit and be magical anymore. Oh, well. Well, Tyra and Seth, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about the skill of receiving feedback. It's not just part of some sort of generic professionalism blog anymore. It is a real skill that we should be looking at and we can promote in our organizations or with the individuals we work with. If folks are interested in reaching out either to ask you more about feedback or some of the other areas that we've sort of been discussing tonight, certainly like, computer-based training as well, Is there a good place that they can reach you both?
Yeah, definitely. So you can reach me at sethgregorywalker@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you have on feedback reception or computer-based instruction.
Yeah, folks could email me at tyrasellers@gmail.com.
Big thanks once again to Dr. Sellers and Dr. Walker for coming on the show, talking all about their research as well as what might be next for the magical feedback that we all know and love. And in addition to thanking Dr. Sellers and Dr. Walker, I also want to thank a few other people. Certainly, I want to thank all of you for listening. We'd really appreciate it if you left us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Maybe subscribe to the show. There are a couple other places that you can reach out to us. We're on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can go to the website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of our previous episodes, links to all of the articles that we have ever discussed, as well as a place to purchase CEs if you're so inclined. If you want these episodes with the subtitling feature, these all also go up on our YouTube page. If you want more ABA Inside Track, why not join us on Patreon, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get early access to our episodes, as well as the ability to vote on some of our upcoming episodes and to join us later in the year for some live episodes that we have planned. If you're interested in even longer podcasts than we normally put out, why not go up to the $10 level where you can get our quarterly book club podcasts. Right when this comes out, we'll have just finished our recording on our latest book club, the book Nudge, the behavioral economic instant classic already. If you want to hear 2+ hours of discussion about a variety of books, including Nudge, as well as some of our older books, discussions like Neurotribes, Meaningful Differences, the other end of the leash, as well as to get additional CEs just for being a subscriber, join us on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And of course, you can always email us with feedback of your own or suggestions for episodes or any questions at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. I also want to make sure to put out that second secret code word, unicorn, the mythical creature with one horn, because as Dr. Sellers will tell you herself, it's not a Dr. Sellers presentation without a unicorn somewhere in it. So here it is, unicorn, UNICORN. Thanks very much to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!